In 52 BC, a commander so legendary his name became a title for emperors, committed an act of pure, calculated madness. Julius Caesar, cornered and out of options, gave an order that defied every principle of warfare. He commanded 50,000 of Rome's finest soldiers to build their own coffin. They would seal themselves inside a ring of wood and earth, trapped between 80,000 bloodthirsty enemies in a fortress and a relief army of 250,000 savages thundering towards them. Think about that. 50,000 men, voluntarily surrounded by 330,000 warriors. No way out, no line of retreat, just the walls at their backs and an ocean of fury on both sides. The fate of Rome and the very future of the West hung on one insane decision. By the end of this video, you'll understand why history's most brilliant general chose to bury his army alive and how this suicidal strategy birthed the most powerful empire the ancient world would ever know. I'm going to reveal 3 shocking truths that will shatter everything you thought you knew about Roman warfare. First, the hidden engineering nightmare that transformed a death trap into an unstoppable meat grinder. Second, the heart-stopping moment Caesar himself had to draw his sword to stop his own line from collapsing. And third, how one chieftain's shattered pride on a blood-soaked field decided the language, culture, and map of Europe for the next 2,000 years. But here's the mystery that has baffled historians for centuries. Why would any sane general personally cut off his own escape? What dark engineering secret allowed 50,000 men to hold a line against an army that stretched to the horizon? How do you even feed a legion while they're constructing 2 massive walls under a constant rain of arrows? How did the Romans not lose their minds fighting back-to-back against 2 separate armies? And what personal burning vendetta drove Caesar to risk everything, his life, his legacy, his entire army, at this godforsaken hill fort in the middle of nowhere? To understand the sheer insanity of Alesia, I need to take you deep into the impossible nightmare Caesar had engineered for himself. If you live for the untold stories of history's most desperate last stands, smash that like button and subscribe to Laugh and Learn Lab for more content that blows your mind. Ring the bell so you never miss a deep dive into the battles that changed everything. Now, let's journey back to a Gaul on the brink of annihilation, where Julius Caesar was about to rewrite the art of war in blood and fire. Gaul in 52 BCE was a tinderbox, and Julius Caesar was the man recklessly throwing torches. For 6 brutal years he had marched his legions across the wild forested landscape, subjugating tribe after tribe in a campaign of pure, unadulterated conquest. But controlling a map is not the same as controlling a people. The Gallic tribes, proud and warlike, were reaching their boiling point. Their pride, their land, their very way of life was under existential threat. And then a firebrand emerged from the Arvini Hills, a prince named Vercingetorix. This wasn't just another tribal chieftain looking for plunder. This man was a visionary, a unifier. He achieved the impossible. He convinced over 40 different tribes, bitter rivals who had been feuding and spilling each other's blood for generations, to lay down their ancient hatreds and stand together under a single banner. Think about the sheer force of will that took. Ancient enemies, from the coast of Armorica to the banks of the Rhine, now marching as one. Caesar's position was far more precarious than most people realize. 6 years of victory parades in Rome meant nothing if he couldn't hold the territory. Back in the Senate, his political enemies, men like Cato and Pompey, were circling, waiting for any sign of failure. The moment he suffered a major defeat, they would pounce, stripping him of his command, his legions, his dignitas. Without his army, Caesar would be defenseless, dragged back to Rome to face trumped-up charges and almost certain exile, or a poisoned cup. This wasn't just about adding another triumph to his name. This was about survival. The Gallic Confederation Vercingetorix built was something new and terrifying to the Romans. We're talking about a coalition that stretched across modern-day France, Belgium, and parts of Germany and Switzerland. Different languages, different customs, different gods of war, all united by one burning singular passion, a deep, abiding hatred for Rome. But this is where Caesar's genius becomes something truly frightening. When his scouts rode back to camp, their faces pale, and reported on the fortress of Alesia, any other general would have hesitated. Any other general would have looked for an easier target. The fortress was a natural marvel of defense. It sat atop a massive plateau, surrounded by deep river valleys and steep hills. The high ground gave its defenders an overwhelming advantage. Attacking it head-on would be a slaughter. Yet Caesar saw what others missed. Vercingetorix had made Alesia his command post, gathering 80,000 of his most elite warriors behind its formidable walls. The Gallic chieftain felt secure. He believed Caesar would never be so foolish as to throw his men against such a fortress. That arrogance would be his undoing. The power dynamics were a fascinating clash of civilizations. The Romans were the invaders, the occupiers, the men who brought their eagles, their laws, and their roads to a land that wanted none of it. But they were also the representatives of order, of discipline, of a civilization that built aqueducts and wrote laws, standing against what they saw as the chaos of the barbarian world. The Gauls were the freedom fighters, defending their homeland, their families, their ancient traditions. But they were also warriors who practiced human sacrifice and believed a man's honor was measured by the number of enemy heads he took as trophies. Caesar needed this victory. Not wanted, needed. His entire career, his vast ambitions, his very life depended on shattering the Gallic Confederation once and for all. Failure meant returning to Rome in disgrace or in chains. Success meant immortality. Vercingetorix needed this victory just as desperately. His people's independence, their culture, their very identity as free Gauls hung in the balance. He had forged this alliance through charisma and force of will, but that unity was brittle. One catastrophic defeat, and it would splinter back into 40 warring factions. The geography of Alesia itself would become a character in this drama. The rivers, the Ouse and the Osirane, carved deep valleys that made cavalry charges a nightmare. The hills, Mont Flavigny, Mont Bussy, created natural amphitheaters of death, perfect for ambushes and killing zones. The fortress walls, built by the Mandubi tribe, were a masterpiece of Gallic engineering, never before breached. But geography is a double-edged sword. Those same features that made Alesia a fortress also made it a cage. Once inside, Vercingetorix's army would consume resources at a staggering rate. 80,000 warriors, plus their horses and the civilians trapped with them, needed mountains of grain and herds of cattle. The very stronghold that protected them could become their tomb. When Caesar's scouts first laid eyes on Alesia's imposing walls, the militarily sound decision would have been to retreat and fight elsewhere. But Caesar was not a sound man. He was a brilliant one. He commanded 10 legions of Rome's best. These weren't fresh-faced recruits. They were hardened professionals, veterans of years of campaigning in Gaul. Each legion, about 5,000 men strong, was a standardized, perfectly oiled killing machine, equipped with the gladius, the scutum, and the pilum, weapons that had carved out an empire. But here's the insane, often overlooked detail. Caesar also had with him 10,000 Germanic cavalry. These weren't Romans. They were mercenaries from across the Rhine, tribes Rome had been fighting just years before. Wild, ferocious horsemen who fought with a primal fury, now riding for Roman gold. That's the kind of ruthless pragmatism that made Caesar so dangerous. His command staff was a who's who of future history. Labienus, his most trusted legate, a tactical mastermind. Mark Antony, young, ambitious, and commanding a wing for the first time. And in a twist of fate that history would never forget, Marcus Brutus, fighting loyally beside the man he would one day help murder on the Ides of March. Imagine the irony. Caesar personally mentoring his future assassin in the art of war. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix commanded his 80,000, but to call it a unified army is to miss the point. This was a confederation of tribal war bands, each with its own chieftain, its own battle standards, its own way of fighting. Noble cavalry in chainmail fought alongside bare-chested berserkers who believed in divine possession. Some carried exquisitely crafted longswords, while others wielded farming tools reforged into weapons. Their strength was their ferocity, their weakness, their lack of Roman discipline. What happened next would defy every convention of ancient warfare. Vercingetorix, knowing his position was strong, sent riders to every corner of Gaul. The greatest levy in Gallic history was summoned. The Confederation demanded a relief force of 250,000 men, and unbelievably, the tribes answered. The call went out, and from every forest, every hill fort, every valley, the warriors of Gaul began to march. Then, Caesar gave the order that made his own officers question his sanity. Instead of mounting a direct assault, instead of laying a simple siege from a safe distance, he commanded something the world had never seen. His legions would build walls. Not just a simple palisade, but a complete unbroken encirclement of the entire Alesia plateau. 11 miles of continuous fortifications. A man-made noose designed to strangle Vercingetorix and his 80,000 men. But Vercingetorix had already made a critical miscalculation. He had packed too many men into Alesia. 80,000 warriors, plus thousands of horses and non-combatants, consumed supplies at a staggering, unsustainable rate. Every day that passed saw hundreds of cattle slaughtered, tons of grain consumed, and water sources strained. The fortress he had chosen for its strength was already becoming a prison. The pre-battle maneuvers were a chess match of brutality. Vercingetorix ordered a scorched earth policy, burning villages and farms, poisoning wells, anything to deny the Romans supplies. But Caesar's Germanic cavalry were like wolves, ranging far and wide, securing food through ruthless foraging and outright theft. Daily, small, vicious skirmishes erupted as Gallic and Roman patrols clashed in the forests and fields. The first major cavalry engagement outside Alesia's walls was a portent of the carnage to come. Thousands of Gallic horsemen charged Caesar's lines. The legionaries formed their disciplined testudos, presenting a wall of shields and iron-tipped pila. But it was the Germanic auxiliaries who turned the tide, sweeping around the flanks with a wild, terrifying fury, cutting down the Gallic cavalry from the sides and rear. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. If the Gallic nobility, their best warriors, couldn't break the Romans on open ground, what chance did the rest have? Roman supply lines were stretched to the breaking point. Feeding 50,000 legionaries plus 10,000 cavalry and their horses was a logistical nightmare. Every day spent building the massive siege works was a day their food reserves dwindled. Caesar was racing against the clock, and the clock was his own army's hunger. The psychological warfare was already in full swing. Gauls lined the walls of Alesia, shouting insults, beating their shields, displaying their vast numbers in a deliberate show of force. They wanted the Romans to look up and see the sea of enemies waiting for them. But Roman discipline, forged in 100 battles, held. Day after day, the legionaries dug, hewed, and built, their movements mechanical, their focus absolute, tuning out the taunts from above. Here, Vercingetorix made his fatal error. He kept his entire force bottled up inside Alesia. He could have left a garrison and taken his mobile field army to harass the Romans or link up with the relief force, but he didn't. Whether it was pride, overconfidence, or a belief that the walls made him invincible, he trapped himself as surely as Caesar was trying to trap him. As the late summer days began to shorten, Caesar's engineers embarked on a project of unprecedented scale and complexity. The first phase, the construction of the circumvallation, the inner wall facing Alesia, began. 11 miles of fortifications, built under constant threat of attack. This wasn't a peaceful construction project. It was building a bomb shelter while the bombs were already falling. The legionaries worked with their shields leaning against the earthen ramparts, one hand on their spade, the other on their sword. Gallic arrows and slingstones rained down constantly. Sorties from Alesia's gates sought to disrupt the work, leading to frantic, close-quarters fights amid half-dug ditches and unfinished timber frames. The specific engineering is where Caesar's genius became terrifyingly clear. This was no simple wall. The Romans dug 2 massive ditches, each 15 feet wide and 15 feet deep. The inner ditch was flooded where water was available, creating a deadly moat. Behind these ditches rose the main rampart, a towering 12-foot-high earthwork, topped with a palisade and watchtowers placed every 80 feet. That's nearly 400 towers along the entire circumference. It was a city of war, built from scratch. Days 4 through 7 saw Vercingetorix's first serious attempts to break the Roman stranglehold. He could not sit idly by and let the trap be sealed. He launched massive, coordinated assaults against the weakest-looking sections of the still incomplete wall. Tens of thousands of Gauls would pour forth from the gates in a screaming tide, desperate to overwhelm the Roman work parties before the encirclement was complete. But the legions held, fighting in rotating lines, one century holding the line while another continued digging and building behind them. It was a display of discipline that baffled the Gauls. Then, the intelligence report Caesar had been dreading finally arrived. His scouts and Germanic riders confirmed it. The relief army was not a myth. It was real. It was massive, and it was closing in fast. Conservative estimates placed it at 250,000 men. Some terrified scouts whispered of 300,000. Caesar stood at a precipice. The logical choice was to break camp, abandon the siege, and fight another day, but logic had left Gaul. Caesar chose the path of glorious, suicidal insanity. He gave a new order, one that must have sucked the air from his command tent. They would build a second wall, the contravallation, a massive 14-mile-long line of fortifications facing outward. His army would now construct a fortress within a fortress, sealing themselves perfectly in the kill zone between the walls of Alesia and the greatest army Gaul had ever assembled. The engineering of this dual-wall system is what separates Caesar from every other commander in history. Beyond the ditches and ramparts, he ordered a nightmarish landscape of obstacles designed to break formations and slaughter attackers. The cippi, sharpened branches woven through felled trees, creating a tangled, chest-high web that would snag and impale any charging infantry or cavalry. But Caesar had one more diabolical invention, an engineering trick that would turn the ground itself into a weapon. The lilies, deep, conical pits, 3 feet deep, with a sharpened stake fixed upright in the bottom, camouflaged by a light covering of brush and leaves. Thousands of these hidden death traps were dug in staggered rows, and in front of it all, they scattered stimuli, vicious iron-barbed spikes, like ancient caltrops, hammered into the ground at angles, invisible to a charging warrior until they punched through his sandals and into his feet. Days 8 through 14 became a desperate, exhausting race against annihilation. The relief army was now a visible presence, its approach marked by a permanent dust cloud on the horizon. Reports from refugees spoke of an endless river of men, a migration of warriors. Caesar's men worked in shifts day and night. Sleep was a forgotten luxury. Men collapsed where they stood, were roused by their centurions, and stumbled back to digging. The Germanic cavalry fought a running war of attrition, skirmishing with the vanguard of the relief force, buying precious hours with their lives. They brought back grim news. The relief army included contingents from every major tribe, the Aedui, the Arverni, the Bellovaci. This wasn't just an army, it was the soul of Gaul, marching to its final reckoning. Hunger began to grip both sides. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix was forced to put his men on severely reduced rations. The civilians trapped inside faced starvation. Outside, Caesar's supply situation was dire. The math was brutal. 60,000 men and thousands of horses consume a mountain of food every single day. Even with the Germanic foragers, starvation was a real and terrifying possibility. Then the unthinkable happened. Doubt began to creep into the Roman ranks. Centurions reported murmuring among the men. These were brave soldiers, veterans who understood courage and accepted death in battle. But to voluntarily build their own prison? To be trapped like rats? Some began to whisper that their commander, in his quest for glory, had finally led them to their doom. Caesar's response was a masterstroke of leadership. He personally toured the fortifications, not with a general's aloofness, but as a fellow soldier. He spoke to work crews, called men by name, praised their efforts, and explained his vision. "We are not building our tomb," he told them, his voice cutting through their fear. "We are building the anvil on which the hammer of Roman discipline will shatter Gallic courage. They have the numbers, but we have the ground. We have the walls. We have the will." The murmuring stopped. The first serious attacks on the outer wall began around day 12. Advanced elements of the relief army probed the contravallation, testing for weak spots. They were just feints, but they revealed the horrifying reality of the coming battle. The Romans would have to fight on two fronts, something no army had ever successfully attempted on this scale. The testimonies of soldiers from this period, preserved in Caesar's own commentaries and later histories, speak of a bone-deep exhaustion mixed with a strange, grim pride. They were part of something never before attempted, building a monument that would be studied for millennia. One legionary was later quoted as saying, "We are either building our glory or our grave. Either way, they will tell stories of this." On September 20th, as the vast host of the Gallic relief army deployed before them, every Roman soldier knew with chilling certainty that they had just finished building the stage for their own epic destruction. Dawn on the first day of the main battle revealed the full, horrifying scale of Caesar's gamble. The Gallic relief army spread across the landscape like a living, breathing plague. 250,000 warriors, a number so vast it defied comprehension, arranged in their tribal contingents, their war horns blaring a dissonant, terrifying symphony. The Romans, in their man-made fortress, were now outnumbered by over 7-1, the perfect anvil caught between the hammer of Alesia and the sledgehammer of the relief force. Commius of the Atrebates led the first massive assault on the outer western walls. 40,000 warriors surged forward in a single screaming wave, their charge shaking the very earth. On cue, from inside Alesia, Vercingetorix launched his own coordinated attack, sending his best men swarming down the slopes against the inner Roman fortifications. For the first time in military history, an army was fighting a determined siege on two fronts simultaneously. The Roman response was a thing of brutal, mechanical beauty. Pre-positioned cohorts wheeled into their assigned sectors with the precision of a machine. The fighting in the towers was immediate and merciless. Gauls swarmed up ladders, only to be met with a forest of Roman pila stabbing downward from the battlements. But the prepared defenses began their grim work. The first wave of Gauls hit the concealed lilies. The sound was sickening. Screams as men plunged their legs into the hidden pits, the sharpened stakes punching through flesh and bone. The stimuli claimed hundreds more, their feet torn to shreds, turning the ground into a carpet of agony. But here is where Caesar's madness was revealed as genius. The cippi, those tangled forests of sharpened branches, funneled the attacking Gauls into predetermined kill zones. They couldn't maintain their formation or their momentum. They had to slow down and pick their way through a maze of death. This gave the Roman artillery, scorpions and ballistae mounted on the towers, perfect, unobstructed targets. Imagine trying to dodge giant iron-tipped bolts the size of spears while navigating a fiendish obstacle course, all while arrows and lead sling bullets darken the sky. The sensory overload was absolute, a hellish cacophony that drove men to the brink of madness. Screams of rage and agony came from both sides, Vercingetorix's men dying against the inner wall, the relief army being slaughtered against the outer wall. The air was so thick with arrows and sling stones that soldiers said the sun was blotted out. The constant, deafening clash of metal on wood, of gladius on shield, of war cries and death rattles created a thunder that left men's ears ringing for days. By midday, a full-blown crisis erupted in the northwest sector. Vercingetorix of Unarverni chieftain and Vercingetorix's own cousin had identified a critical weakness where the Roman outer wall crossed low, swampy ground and couldn't be built to full height. He led 60,000 hand-picked elite warriors in a concentrated attack on this single point. The two Roman legions defending it, about 10,000 men, were suddenly facing odds of 6-1. Caesar, watching from his central command post, his red paludamentum clearly visible to all, faced an impossible choice: reinforce the northwest and risk another section of the massive perimeter collapsing, or trust his men to hold against an overwhelming focused assault. This was the moment that cemented the Caesar legend. He dispatched only 6,000 reserves, just enough to stem the bleeding, not enough to cripple his other defenses. The fighting there reached an inhuman level of intensity. Romans fought in shifts, fresh sentries rotating into the line as exhausted, blood-soaked men stumbled back to grab a mouthful of water. But there were only so many fresh troops. By late afternoon, some units had been rotated 3 times. Men fought on with grievous wounds, because there was literally nowhere to retreat to. The statistics are staggering to contemplate. At the peak of the battle, Roman archers and slingers were unleashing over 100,000 projectiles per hour. Every archer had bundles of arrows pre-positioned at his station. The killing ground between the obstacles and the walls became a grotesque carpet of the dead and dying. Wounded Gauls, trapped by the press of their own comrades pushing from behind, were trampled or died slowly where they fell. Nightfall brought no respite. The Gauls lit torches and continued their assaults in the flickering darkness. Romans now fought by sound and feel, stabbing at shapes that loomed out of the blackness. The confusion was total. In the chaos, friend killed friend by mistake. Officers lost all control of their units, the battle devolving into 1,000 disconnected life-and-death struggles in the dark. And once again, physics and preparation favored the Romans. The lilies, completely invisible at night, claimed a fresh harvest of victims. Gauls carrying torches made perfect targets for Roman javelins and arrows. The stimuli continued to maim anyone who took a step in the wrong direction. Gallic formations, already loose, disintegrated entirely as men stumbled over corpses and tried to rescue friends screaming in the pits. Dawn on the second day revealed a landscape from a nightmare. Mounds of bodies piled 10 feet high in some places. The wounded writhed and moaned amidst the dead. But the relief army was not finished. Fresh tribal contingents moved forward, their faces set in grim determination, stepping over the corpses of their countrymen as if they were mere logs. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix prepared for his all-or-nothing final assault. This is where Gallic honor met Roman pragmatism, and pragmatism was about to win a brutal victory. Caesar received simultaneous panicked reports. Labienus's sector in the northwest was on the verge of total collapse. 6 cohorts had been fighting for over 20 hours straight. The legate himself was wounded, but still standing in the front rank, sword in hand. Without immediate massive reinforcement, the entire northern line would be breached. At the exact same time, Mark Antony's position was being hit by another wave of 40,000 Gauls. The future triumvirate, with just 6,000 exhausted men, sent a desperate message: cannot hold much longer. Caesar faced every commander's ultimate nightmare: 2 simultaneous catastrophic breakthroughs and not enough reserves to save both. But then, an event occurred that no one, even the calculating Caesar, had foreseen. The Germanic cavalry, held in reserve in the central enclosure, saw the crisis unfolding and took the initiative. Their chieftain, a man whose name is lost to history, made a split-second decision. Without waiting for orders, 4,000 of these wild horsemen charged out of a rear gate, riding at a full gallop in a wide arc around the entire battlefield to smash into the rear of the Gauls assaulting Labienus. Caesar, seeing this, made his choice. Taking his last remaining reserve, a mere 13 cohorts, about 6,500 men, he split them. Half he sent to reinforce Antony, the other half he led personally to Labienus's disintegrating sector. But here is the detail that changes everything. He didn't just send them, he led them from the front, his red general's cloak streaming behind him, a brilliant beacon visible to every Roman on the walls. The psychological impact was instantaneous and electric. Exhausted legionaries who could barely lift their shields saw their general charging towards the point of maximum danger. A roar went up along the walls. "Caesar is coming!" spreading faster than any wildfire. Men on the brink of collapse found a final, desperate reservoir of strength. What happened in the next 60 minutes decided the fate of Western civilization. 3 forces converged on the northwest sector in a perfect, brutal pincer. Labienus's battered men held the wall, pushing back with their last ounce of strength. Caesar's fresh cohorts hit the Gauls from the inside of the Roman lines, and the Germanic cavalry, like demons unleashed, smashed into the Gallic rear. Vercingetorix's 60,000 men were caught in a perfect trap. Pressed from the front, flank, and rear, and crushed against their own dead and the Roman obstacles, they had nowhere to go. The slaughter was absolute. Unable to retreat through the press of their own numbers, unable to advance through Roman steel, they died in heaps. The Germanic horsemen, in their element, showed no mercy, cutting down fleeing warriors with a savage efficiency that shocked even the hardened legionaries. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix watched his cousin's elite force be systematically annihilated. He had launched his own final assault, throwing every remaining warrior he had against the inner walls. For a few breathless minutes, it seemed it might work. Gallic warriors actually breached the inner Roman wall in 3 separate places. This is when the situation went from desperate to utterly apocalyptic. Caesar, still a brilliant red spot on the battlefield, made a decision that military academies still teach. He left his subordinates to manage the outer battle and personally led a charge back towards the inner wall. The sight of their commander, racing from one crisis to another, personally leading the counterattack, solidified the Roman will. Men who had been on the verge of breaking now stood like iron. But the Gauls fought with the courage of the doomed. They knew this was their very last chance. Warriors deliberately threw themselves onto Roman spears to create a gap for the man behind them. Noble cavalrymen dismounted, choosing to die fighting on foot rather than live in shame. The fighting reached a crescendo of violence so extreme that survivors could only speak of it in hushed tones years later. Then came the moment that broke the Gallic spirit forever. The main force of the relief army, seeing the utter destruction of Vercingetorix's attack, seeing their best and bravest butchered to a man, shattered. It wasn't a retreat, it was a rout, a mindless, panicked stampede. 200,000 men turned their backs and ran, scattering to the four winds, abandoning the 80,000 souls trapped in Alesia to their fate. From the high walls of the fortress, Vercingetorix saw it happen. The army he had summoned, the hope of Gaul, dissolving into a fleeing mob. His own assault on the inner walls faltered, then died as the devastating news spread through the ranks. Warriors who had been prepared to die moments before now stood in stunned, hopeless silence. The greatest host Gaul would ever assemble had vanished. Caesar seized the moment with ruthless efficiency. His fresh Germanic cavalry poured out of the gates, pursuing the fleeing Gauls for miles, cutting them down without mercy. Roman infantry sorted from the fortifications, mopping up any remaining resistance. The battle became a rout, and the rout became a massacre. The killing only stopped when the Romans were too exhausted to lift their swords any longer. Dawn on the third day was eerily silent. No war horns, no battle cries, no drums. From the highest tower of Alesia, a single white flag slowly rose. After witnessing the cowardice of the relief army, after losing his best warriors, Vercingetorix called his final war council. The Gallic chieftains faced a bitter, brutal choice: fight to the last man and face certain annihilation, or surrender and beg for a mercy the Romans were not known for. Some advocated a glorious death in battle. Others, more pragmatic, pointed to the women, children, and non-combatants trapped with them who were already starving. The debate was fierce, but Vercingetorix himself ended it with a stunning act of leadership. "I did not unite Gaul for my own pride," he reportedly said. "I united it for our freedom. I will not see it extinguished for my pride alone." He would surrender himself, personally taking full responsibility upon his own head in the desperate hope that Caesar would be merciful to his defeated people. It was the decision of a true king, sacrificing himself for his subjects. The final casualty figures are brutal. In 2 days of fighting, approximately 40,000 Gauls lay dead between the Roman walls. Thousands more perished in the merciless pursuit. Roman casualties, while heavy, were miraculously light by comparison. Around 5,000 dead and 12,000 wounded. The lilies and stimuli alone had killed more Gauls than many full-scale battles. The surrender ceremony was crafted for maximum psychological impact. Vercingetorix donned his most splendid armor, polished his finest helmet, and mounted his best war horse. He rode out from the gates of Alesia alone, a solitary figure of defiance and defeat. He approached Caesar's command post, where the general sat enthroned on a raised platform. In a final, poignant act of Gallic pride, Vercingetorix rode his horse in a complete circle around the seated Caesar. Then he dismounted, stripped off his armor, and laid his sword and helmet at the Roman's feet. He then sat silently at the foot of the platform, a captive. Caesar, the master of propaganda, remained seated throughout, accepting the submission without a word. The symbolism was devastating. the vibrant, chaotic spirit of Gaul, brought to its knees by the cold, unyielding order of Rome. In that single, silent moment, an independent Gaul ceased to exist. The practical aftermath began with cold Roman efficiency. The 80,000 survivors filed out of Alesia and laid their weapons down in enormous piles. Roman quartermasters spent days cataloging the spoils: swords, shields, spears, and torques by the tens of thousands. Here is the chilling detail that reveals the true nature of Roman conquest. Caesar's treatment of the prisoners was a calculated political act. Warriors from tribes like the Aedui, whom Rome needed as future allies, were disarmed and released. But for approximately 40,000 others, a far grimmer fate awaited. They were distributed among the legions as slaves, the spoils of war, a tangible reward for the soldiers who had endured the impossible. The dispatches Caesar sent back to Rome were masterpieces of propaganda. He was the savior of the Republic, the pacifier of Gaul, the man who had ended the barbarian threat forever. He conveniently omitted the fact that his own aggressive expansionist policies had created the crisis in the first place. Victory has a way of sanitizing history. The immediate consequence of Alesia was the total and utter submission of Gaul. Within months, the last embers of resistance were snuffed out. Tribes that had fought for generations suddenly accepted Roman governors, Roman taxes, and Roman law. The cultural transformation was breathtakingly swift. Within a generation, Gallic nobles were speaking Latin and sending their sons to be educated in Rome. The human cost, however, was monstrous. The Gallic Wars are estimated to have cost 1 million Gallic lives, with another million enslaved. Entire tribal identities were wiped from the map. Alesia was the final, decisive stroke in this cultural genocide. But its impact reverberated far beyond Gaul. Caesar's double wall tactic became the new gold standard for siege warfare. His specifications for lilies, cippi, and stimuli were copied for centuries. Napoleon Bonaparte, a keen student of war, would later make a pilgrimage to the site, trying to decipher the secrets of Caesar's genius. Politically, Alesia made Caesar untouchable. His enemies in the Senate were silenced. How could they accuse of incompetence the man who had defeated 1/3 men with 50,000? The immense wealth from plunder and the sale of slaves made him the richest man in Rome. Most importantly, the fanatical loyalty of his veteran legions, forged in the hell of Alesia, would follow him unconditionally when he later crossed the Rubicon and plunged the Republic into civil war. Culturally, Alesia accelerated the Romanization of Western Europe. Latin replaced Gaulish. Roman roads crisscrossed the landscape. Gallic gods were merged with the Roman pantheon. The Gallo-Roman civilization that emerged would become the direct ancestor of medieval and modern France, its Latin roots forever buried in the soil of Alesia. The philosophical lesson of Alesia is stark. When is risking everything the only rational choice? Caesar was facing political and physical destruction, so he chose the most audacious, seemingly insane option, trapping his army, because conventional warfare could not deliver the total victory he needed. Sometimes the most insane plan is the only sane one. Modern military doctrine still echoes Alesia. The principles of using terrain, preparation, and engineering to nullify an enemy's numerical advantage are as true today for a special forces unit defending an outpost as they were for the legions. Caesar's gamble proved that fortune truly does favor the bold. By refusing to accept defeat, by embracing the impossible, he demonstrated that discipline, engineering, and sheer unadulterated audacity could overcome any numerical disadvantage. 50,000 disciplined men could indeed defeat 330,000 brave ones. The historical pivot of Alesia cannot be overstated. Without a secure Roman Gaul, there is no buffer against the Germanic tribes for 4 centuries. Without that buffer, the Roman Empire might have collapsed much earlier. Without the stability of the Pax Romana, the preservation of Greek and Roman knowledge through the Dark Ages is jeopardized. The very trajectory of Western civilization was fundamentally altered on those blood-soaked September days in 52 BC. Caesar buried 50,000 men alive, and in doing so laid the foundation for an empire that would shape the world for 1,000 years. Alesia stands as an eternal reminder that when faced with impossible odds, the answer isn't always to retreat. It's to dig in, prepare, and through discipline, engineering, and sheer unadulterated audacity, make the impossible possible. If your mind is reeling from the sheer scale and audacity of the Battle of Alesia, then you need to join us for more. This is the kind of deep dive, epic storytelling we live for here at Laugh and Learn Lab. We untangle the myths, reveal the secrets, and bring history's most incredible moments to life. So if you haven't already, smash that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss an adventure. We have so many more stories to tell, from the Spartan stand at Thermopylae to the genius of Admiral Yi Sen-sin. Let us know in the comments what other impossible battles or historical gambles you want us to cover next. Thanks for watching, and remember, history isn't just about dates, it's about the decisions that changed everything. Until next time, keep laughing and keep learning.